The message was supposed to go to my best friend. Instead, it landed on the phone of the coldest woman in our company, the CEO, who had never smiled at me once. I realized my mistake exactly 7 seconds after pressing send. By then, there was no way to unsend it. I stared at the screen in horror, watching the tiny words, "Seen," appear beneath the message. Then came the worst part. 5 minutes later, someone knocked on my apartment door. Before we begin, if you believe kindness can heal people and everyone deserves a second chance, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. Your support helps us bring more stories about unexpected kindness, second chances, and the people who discover that love can appear in the places they least expect it. My name is Rowan Mercer, and at 31, I had become very good at pretending everything was fine. Every morning, I rode the crowded train downtown, walked 6 blocks to the glass tower where I worked, and spent 10 hours making sure other people's mistakes never reached the CEO's desk. I was a project coordinator at Halcyon Systems, a company famous for its ruthless efficiency and its even more ruthless chief executive, Serafina Vale. She was 36, brilliant, wealthy, impossibly composed, and so emotionally distant that employees joked she could make a summer afternoon feel like winter simply by walking into the room. Nobody knew much about her personal life. She arrived early, left late, never attended office parties, and seemed to have built an invisible wall around herself. I had never been particularly afraid of her, but I respected the wall. I also had a private weakness that I would never have admitted to anyone. I admired her. Not because she was rich or powerful, but because I had seen things other people hadn't. Once, I noticed her quietly paying for an employee's emergency surgery through an anonymous company fund. Another time, I saw her stay in the office until midnight helping a young intern prepare for a presentation, even though she could have simply sent someone else. She was cold on the outside, but every now and then, there were tiny cracks in that armor, and through those cracks I could see someone who cared far more than she wanted the world to know. That particular Tuesday afternoon had been exhausting. I had spent the morning fixing a disastrous presentation, calming an angry client, and covering for a coworker who had called in sick. Around 3 o'clock, I finally escaped to the building's rooftop garden with a paper cup of coffee. The sun was bright, the sky almost painfully blue, and for the first time all day, I could breathe. I pulled out my phone to text my friend Calder about the woman I had been secretly crushing on for months. I typed, "If she keeps looking at me like that, I'm going to forget every professional rule I've ever learned." Honestly, I'd let her boss me around all afternoon. I pressed send without checking the name. 3 seconds later, I looked up and realized the message had gone to Serafina Vale. My stomach dropped. I checked again. Her name was right there at the top of the conversation. Serafina Vale. My CEO. My boss. The woman who could fire me with one sentence. I nearly dropped my phone over the railing. I immediately typed an apology, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too, and finally sent a pathetic message explaining that the text was meant for someone else. The response came almost instantly. Interesting. That was it. One word. I spent the next 5 minutes convinced my career was over. I imagined security escorting me out. I imagined HR calling. I imagined Calder laughing so hard that he would never recover. Then came the knock. I opened my apartment door, and my entire body went still. Serafina stood in the hallway. It was daytime, sunlight spilling through the corridor windows behind her. She wasn't wearing the severe black suit I was accustomed to seeing at the office. Instead, she wore a simple cream blouse beneath a tailored jacket, her dark hair loosely tied back. She looked less like a CEO and more like a woman who had simply walked away from a difficult life for a few minutes. She studied me quietly before saying, with an almost unreadable expression, "Say that again." I thought my heart actually stopped. I stammered that I was sorry, that the message was meant for someone else, and that I had absolutely no intention of disrespecting her. She stepped inside only after I moved aside, then looked around my small apartment. It wasn't impressive. The furniture didn't match. The kitchen had a tiny refrigerator. There were second-hand books stacked beside the sofa and a dying plant near the window. She noticed everything. Then she surprised me by smiling. Not the polite corporate smile she occasionally used in meetings. A real smile. She told me she hadn't come because of the text. At least, not entirely. She had come because my apology sounded different from the apologies she usually received. Most people apologized because they were afraid of losing their jobs. I had apologized because I was embarrassed that I had made her uncomfortable. She sat near the window while I stood awkwardly across from her, still wondering whether I was trapped inside some elaborate dream. Then she confessed something that changed the entire atmosphere. She said she had been noticing me for months too. I didn't know what to say. She explained that most employees treated her like a machine. They brought numbers, reports, complaints, and requests. I was different. I once left a cup of tea outside her office after noticing she had been coughing. I had fixed a presentation she hadn't asked me to fix because I knew she was preparing for an important investor meeting. I had never tried to impress her. I had simply been kind. She admitted that kindness frightened her. Her father had built the company before turning it into a battlefield. He had taught her that showing emotion made people weak, and after his death, she had spent years trying to become the kind of person nobody could hurt. She succeeded so well that eventually nobody knew how to reach her. Then she told me about her mother. Her voice changed when she spoke about her. Her mother had suffered a serious illness years earlier, and Serafina had been traveling constantly for work during that period because her father insisted the company came first. By the time she understood how much her mother needed her, there was no time left to repair what had been lost. Her mother died believing her daughter cared more about business than family. Serafina had carried that guilt ever since. I finally understood the coldness. It wasn't arrogance. It was armor. I told her that being strong didn't mean never needing anyone. I told her that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was admit they were tired. She stared at me for a long moment, and then something in her expression softened. That afternoon, we didn't kiss. Nothing dramatic happened. We simply talked. For the first time in years, Serafina talked to someone without calculating what she would gain or lose. And for the first time in months, I forgot about deadlines, bills, and the fear that I wasn't doing enough with my life. Before leaving, she paused at my doorway and thanked me for seeing a person instead of a position. The next morning at work, everything felt different. She was still the CEO. I was still an ordinary employee. There were still meetings, deadlines, and impossible clients. But during one meeting, when everyone was arguing over a failed project, Serafina looked at me and asked what I thought. Nobody had ever asked me that in front of the executive team before. I spoke honestly. She listened. The project was eventually saved. Weeks passed. Our relationship grew slowly, carefully, and respectfully. There were no secret office romances or reckless decisions. We learned about each other outside the titles attached to our names. She learned that I cooked terrible pasta but loved trying. I learned that she secretly adored old romantic movies and cried whenever she watched them alone. She discovered that I called my sister every Sunday. I discovered that she kept a small box of handwritten letters from her mother in the bottom drawer of her bedroom. One Saturday afternoon, Serafina asked me to accompany her to the cemetery where her mother was buried. The sky was bright and warm. Birds moved through the trees, and sunlight fell gently across the stone markers. She stood beside the grave holding the old box of letters. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she finally admitted that she had spent years believing she had failed her mother. I told her that regret could become a prison if we allowed it to. We couldn't change yesterday, but we could decide what we did with tomorrow. She placed one of the letters against her heart and closed her eyes. When she opened them, tears were running down her cheeks. That was the moment I realized the woman everyone called cold had never been cold at all. She had simply been waiting for someone safe enough to thaw around. Months later, our relationship became public after we both decided there was nothing shameful about it. Some employees whispered. Some questioned whether I had received special treatment. Serafina responded by making one thing clear: my work would always be judged separately from our relationship. She even removed herself from decisions involving my promotions. And somehow, that made me love her more. Because the woman who had once built walls around herself was now building boundaries that protected both of us. One afternoon, almost a year after that accidental text, I returned home from work to find Serafina waiting outside my apartment. She held a small envelope in her hand. Inside was a photograph of us sitting in the rooftop garden where everything had started. On the back, she had written a sentence. "You accidentally sent me a message, but somehow you became the answer to one I had been too afraid to ask." I looked at her, speechless. She laughed softly and told me that sometimes life didn't give people what they planned for. Sometimes it gave them what they needed. I thought about that first message, the embarrassing sentence that nearly destroyed my career, and smiled. If I could go back, I wouldn't change it. Because the biggest mistakes aren't always disasters. Sometimes, they are doors. And sometimes, behind those doors is a person who has been waiting years for someone to knock. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes people can change, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. You never know whose life might be changed by a simple story about kindness. And before you go, special request, comment: everyone deserves a second chance, if you believe the people who seem coldest may simply be the ones who have been hurt the most. Because in the end, Serafina didn't need someone to save her. She needed someone willing to see her. And Rowan didn't need a perfect love story. He needed someone who could teach him that courage wasn't always about making the right choice. Sometimes, courage was admitting you had made a mistake, opening the door anyway, and discovering that on the other side was the person who had been waiting to say that again.